This week you're looking at the geography of economics or economic geography. And the book starts out with just this idea of defining economic development. And in general, it's this idea of moving from an agriculturally focused labor force to an industrial labor force. And the belief that you're transforming raw materials into commodities. And in one of the videos, you'll hear the gentleman talk a lot about commodities. Basically, they're things that can be sold, and then they have an added value. So when we try to understand economic development, we can look at the relationship between that standard of living, and so we've looked at the Human Development Index, we've looked at the infant mortality rate, and as indicators of general development. So when we think of a country with a low standard of living, when you look at the statistics, those countries tend to have agricultural based subsistence agriculture, or a majority of the labor force working in agriculture, and typically not agriculture for mass consumption. So with this belief system, and this came out of the post Second World War, when there was a need to help develop a lot of the European countries that had been devastated from war. The U.S. said we need to figure out ways to improve technology and skills so that countries are more developed or more industrialized. So one measure that people use to look at the economic development, and you've heard this a lot, is the GDP, the gross domestic product. And this is just the sum of everything a country produces, and everything, all of the services that a country is able to render. And we'll look at the difference between goods and services when we look at different economic sectors. Often people use the term third world country, first world country, and these are really not current terms. We tend to think about countries as developed or developing. You'll also sometimes see the term MDC, or more developed countries, and LDC, less developed countries, and these terms are passé. So we can use the GDP to make a map of formal economic regions based on development indicators. And so what you would see is a pretty interesting regional split, with the northern hemisphere being more developed, the southern hemisphere being less developed, with some exceptions with Australia and some of the other countries coming in above the equator. But you really see a north-south split in development. I thought this was a pretty interesting map showing the different prosperity of countries, and so the dark brown is low development, the green of course is high prosperity, and then the orange is on the low side, and the yellow is on the other side. So you really get to see a core of developing regions in the world as being in African region. So the book talks about economic activities as primary industries, secondary industries, and then it goes into defining services. There are the service industries. And in some texts you'll hear the services divided into three subcategories called tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. But I'm looking at several new textbooks, and they tend to group everything in just a general service area. And I think part of that is because in the quaternary and the quinary, things are moving very quickly. A primary industry is an industry where there is an extraction of natural resources. So basically farming, fishing, mining, some people call it lumbering or timber cutting, and in general the resource is removed and sent somewhere else, usually to a more developed country for processing, although this is beginning to change as the world is becoming much more a global industry. When we look at primary industries, you're thinking about other economic indicators or development indicators as well. Secondary industries then are when a commodity is created. So you've added some value to that raw material. And this is what is been identified as that huge stage in development of a country, is being able to have manufacturing plants or being able to manufacture goods, create commodities. So the changing of ore to steel, the moving of timber to lumber or logs, fishing, canning, creating shirts or garments out of cotton. And this landscape of industry is really shrinking, and again, part of this global network, global economy, you're being able to see more and more manufacturing sites set up in countries that would not be considered developed. But basically you see a very uneven development in the world between primary, secondary industries. And this, due to globalization, you end up with a core and periphery of development, so that the core, the headquarters, the offices might be in a developed country and the factories are in a periphery or a less developed or developing countries. This global economic development has really increase the deindustrialization of places. We'll look at some examples of the Rust Belt in the United States, where manufacturing and headquarters used to be in one place, and now these places are split and give rise to the development of multinational corporations. Here's an example of a Nike factory in Seoul, Korea. A strong indication of a very modern plant and definitely a secondary industry. The tertiary services begin with transportation. So you can imagine that once you have a factory, you need to get those goods and services out to other places. You've got to bring raw materials in. So this really helps to facilitate the distribution and the manufacturing. When you think of tertiary services, nothing is produced, but things are moved and delivered. And so the landscape of secondary and tertiary might look something like this. So here are shipping. Our oceans still are the primary transportation route for most goods and services. The use of oil, the use of energy, building of roads, all of these are in the tertiary component as related to moving materials and actually supplying plants. Sometimes you'll have huge water systems built because often plants need a lot of water in processing. I thought this was just, trucking, still a huge tertiary industry, shipping up in the top corner. And it was an interesting story several years ago when it was realized that foreign countries actually owned shipping ports. And so there was not a lot of regulation, and we were very worried about 9/11 and terrorists moving materials into the country. And so there was huge legislative uproar about who owns our ports. The fourth service is producer service under quaternary services. And again, this is the banking, the insurance, the kind of the brains of an operation. And several years ago, about 65% of the United States industry was involved in just quaternary services. So you can see very little is produced in a quaternary-based economy, but the interests of the economy are now with globalization in many other places in the world. This is a nice landscape of producer services. This is in Rio de Janeiro. High-rise buildings, a lot of banking, insurance centers in that landscape. Again, another producer services landscape in Singapore. And again in South Korea. So we can see that countries now, developed countries, have multiple avenues for their economic sector. And then the final subcategory under services is consumer services, and this would be the quinary sector. And again, this is the headquarters, the government, the scientific research, health and medicine, and in some aspects tourism. And the book has a great section on looking at the development of tourism or the offerings of tourism to developed countries from developing countries, and the impact of the impact on the environment from a lot of tourist activities. Then the book takes you through some information on diffusion of the Industrial Revolution, and I want you to really think about, was this relocation diffusion? Was this stimuli diffusion? Was it hierarchical? And if it was hierarchical diffusion, was it expansion? Was it contagion? So kind of look at that mechanism, read through the Industrial Revolution just for the high points of that. I'm not really interested in kind of that high detail of cottage industries. But really this idea was that once you began to be able to mass produce materials, then you also need somebody to sell them to. And so one hand feeds the other, where there were more materials manufactured, and then there were more railroads and roads built to deliver those goods and services, which created also the ability to manufacture in different places. So this whole development of our economy. And today, when we look at the diffusion, we're really going nationally. Global transportation involved in being able to reach out and grab materials from very early countries very early in their development, and then using those materials elsewhere. One of the things that's really important, though, is transportation costs are skyrocketing as oil prices go up, shipping prices go up, just general transportation goes up, and so the cost of commodities, for moving commodities from one place to another, is a huge factor in just economic decisions. I was looking at some of the book talks about transnational companies, and so I was just using Wikipedia, trying to say, okay, who are the big countries in the world? And it just surprised me that General Electric in the United States is considered one of the top 10 transnational companies. You can see a lot of transnational companies are primarily or had been oil companies. And then when I look at GE, you can see all of the aspects of the economy that GE is in. So they're in research, they're in energy, they're in power, capital is banking. So it looks to me as if GE is has its fingers in kind of every aspect of economic development. The book has a term called technopoles, and these are, I thought this was a kind of a great modern pop culture geography, that these countries are these are regions of high-tech manufacturing. Many of these are the result of deindustrialization, so that many people find themselves moving from kind of a manufacturing job to needing other kinds of jobs, and then the development of high tech has taken over that niche. So these places are often centered together to kind of develop a synergy of thinking and thought and development. And that is a crazy statement, but we'll keep moving on. But it was interesting to me to see that 5 of the top 20 technopoles are in the United States. But then there's places, Sydney, Australia, Sao Paulo, Singapore, Melbourne. We are not alone in having high-tech development, of course. And then we'll move a little bit to the deindustrialization, and this is just a decline of former industrial areas. You see this a lot in European cities, and the landscape of deindustrialization is low employment, people migrating to new employment, decaying factories, and this is often a result of following new, cheaper labor. So we can look at Detroit as an example of a classic example of a city that's gone through this economic change from manufacturing, a very profitable city, into a bankrupt city today. So in 1903, the Ford Motor Company had revolutionary ideas in mass production and the assembly line, and then created this area where other automobile companies began to develop too. And this was an example of a perfect site and situation. So they were near primary ore sites. There was water for power, there's water for transportation, and then there was a huge labor force that had been there from shipping, and also it was an immigrant destination place. In 73 and again in 79, the oil crisis or the gas crisis changed the U.S. focus from large cars to small cars, and many of the small cars were foreign car makers, so manufacturers. So this really changed the focus for Detroit. And then as the industrial South began to develop, labor was cheaper, factories were newer, that you didn't have to kind of rebuild a factory to fit the new modern manufacturing protocols. Then you began to see an abandonment of the factories in Detroit. And in July 18th of this year, the city of Detroit applied for federal bankruptcy. And so this is kind of the Rust Belt is along that Great Lakes region in northeast United States, and this kind of landscape of decay where you have just empty factories and empty infrastructure, and then houses decay, neighborhoods, schools, people aren't paying taxes, the government can't run, so it's a real snowballing effect of just decline. And then on the other side you get to see the development in South Carolina, where the location of some of these new factories have gone. One of the hallmarks of globalization is outsourcing. So we've got places doing jobs in multiple areas, and the location of these jobs keeps changing as the labor force changes or becomes cheaper or more expensive. And one of the things that people are looking at is the decline of cheap labor from the Chinese sector, and that this area of the world, the labor forces are going up, and one of China's goals is to be able to manufacture more goods and services to reach the global market and also the domestic market. And one way they're going to do that is to encourage people to move in from rural areas into the city, where they can have higher paying jobs, where they will have more capital to spend, and then create their own market. And this will also kind of lead into next week's topic, which is about urbanization and this whole flood of people into cities. Let's see. So when we think about the development of supranational coalitions, the EU, NAFTA, all of these political agreements have been developed to help remove that obstacles to moving goods and services, money, material globally. And NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was an agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that was designed to help the trade or the transfer of goods and services between countries. So one of the outcomes of NAFTA is maquiladoras, which are areas on either side or on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexican border. These are manufacturing zones that have less restriction as far as environmental, as far as workers' rights. They tend to have lower wages, hire young people, and typically young women. And this makes up about 20% of Mexico's labor force. And in the 80s, that was the beginning of these factories, and it really creates this amazing landscape of kind of poor factory towns on one side of the U.S. border and more affluent headquarters on the U.S. side of the maquiladora zones. And so there's a couple videos this week looking at NAFTA and the maquiladora. And so in a way, does this take us back to this idea of colonization, where you develop materials and manufacture information, and you pull the profits out, you pull the materials out from less developed or developing countries. And in Mexico and other Latin American countries, about 4/5 of the profit is taken by the U.S. by U.S. corporations and does not stay with the country. Let's see, Juarez, the city of Juarez is the site of one of the large maquiladoras. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the world, and it's also considered one of the most violent cities in the world. It has 300 maquiladoras in that town again, and since 1990 there have been approximately 600 known femicides or deaths of young women, and they believe that that is directly related to the development of these maquiladoras. Fast-paced, rules and regulations are different, and in 2009, I don't know what the murder rate is today, but it was considered one of the highest murder rates in the world. So there's a video on the maquiladora and its development that you'll need to watch today. So we can look at just the U.S. labor force. So this is a little bit more current, and I collapsed all of the quaternary, quinary, and tertiary services together. And so you can see that Afghanistan is definitely a developing country, and we would also look at that by the population pyramid, could give us an indicator of that. But 78% of their economy is based on primary resources, so extraction of resources or of the labor force. And look at the U.S., only 0.7% of our workforce is actually involved in primary, which is probably agriculture for the most part. We have about 20% manufacturing and almost 80% in services, transportation, business banking kinds of activities. Again, with Australia, the United Kingdom would probably be then in the developed area. China would be in developing, definitely more developed than Afghanistan when we just look at the straight numbers, but not on the same development index as some of the other countries in this in that table. So there's several videos to watch this week. One is called After NAFTA, and it is it's a discussion by, I think it's PBS, looking at in a small Indiana town in the Midwest and what happened with the development as NAFTA went through and the manufacturing moved from Indiana to Mexico. A great example of the Rust Belt. Mexico and the United States is a viewpoint from a maquiladora. There's a video called Are Droids Taking Our Jobs? And the man says yes, but he really talks about why that might be a good thing. So I really want you to watch that. Paul Kohler has a video called The Bottom Billion and talks about the US's and other developed countries' response. How do we help people become more developed? He talks about good governance and this idea that good governance is fair, it has people's best interest at heart, and it's kind of a more developed, high-minded sense of governance. And then he talks about commodities, which are the development of goods and services. And then the last video is one called China's Demographic Problem, and this really beautifully ties in to chapter 2 when we talked about demographics, we talked about gender imbalance. What does a country do who has an uneven development and then is trying to move from an agricultural focus to a more developed focus? And when you have that upside down pyramid where you're not at replacement, how is that going to impact the economy? And so China is an example of an upside down economic upside down demographic pyramid, but so is Japan, so is France. So how is that going to help? How are people going to address that in the future? So lots of little videos. They're just fascinating, and I think it's going to be an important week. Thanks a bunch.